Hello and welcome to the George Washington University. I'm Anand Naidu and thank you for joining us as we bring you a special CGTN Town Hall production. 40 years ago, China changed direction and embarked on a major reform and opening up policies. Over the last 4 decades, it has experienced extraordinary change and is now the world's second largest economy. In a moment, we will discuss how China did that and we'll look at how the country has transformed itself. We will also explore the global impact of that transformation and discuss what's next for China and the world. So please settle in and get ready for our special program, 40 Years and Beyond, China Reform and Opening Up. Okay, let me introduce our distinguished panel. With us is Zhou Jingxing. He is Minister Counselor and Director of the Political Section of the Chinese Embassy in the United States. Also joining us is Robert Hormats. He's a former US Undersecretary of State and Vice Chairman of Kissinger Associates. With us too is Martin Jacques. He is Senior Fellow of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University, and he's the author of When China Rules the World. And with us too is Yukon Huang. He is Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Asia Program, and he's the author of Cracking the China Conundrum, Why Conventional Wisdom is Wrong. Please give our panel a warm welcome. Thank you. We have lots to discuss, but before we get into it, let's look at some of the key events from this period. Here's an overview from CGTN's correspondent, Nathan King.
From Shanghai to Shenzhen, Xiamen to Tianjin, and hundreds of cities across China, the country has been transformed. In 40 years, China has developed at a pace that has taken other nations centuries. And on this anniversary, it's only fitting to ask, how did China get to do it? It's been a unique journey that began with little fanfare in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping, reform inside China and an opening up to the world. While much has been made of the rapprochement with the United States in the 1970s, culminating with the restoration of full diplomatic relations in 1979, China's re-engagement was truly global. Deng's visit to Singapore and Japan, instrumental in showing Chinese leadership what was possible. Pilot projects in Guangzhou and Shenzhen, and centres of excellence in Tianjin and beyond all led to a booming economy, lifting around 750 million people out of poverty.
China has pursued its development through opening up. As a result, China's import and export of goods have grown by 198 times, and those of services by over 148 times.
Development at home and a secure and peaceful environment abroad enabled China to embrace the post-Cold War world, joining global institutions like the World Trade Organization at the end of 2001, and contributing more to multilateralism at the United Nations.
It's already the largest middle-class country in the world.
For Cheng Li, a renowned US-China scholar who grew up in this period, the transformation has been nothing short of a miracle.
China was poor, rigid, colorless, and isolated. It was a really different China. At that time, I never imagined I would come to the United States and now become a Chinese American, work in a think tank in the United States. So it's really one of the most dramatic changes in the 20th and 21st century.
China now accounts for 40% of global growth annually. It's the world's biggest exporter, and in 2011 overtook Japan as the second largest economy.
China has helped transform not only itself, but also the global economy.
During 40 years of reform and opening up, China has been labelled the world's factory floor. But that too is changing. Innovation is now one of the drivers of China's 21st century economy. It has become a global leader in artificial intelligence, supercomputing, gene splicing, and electric cars. And China's manufacturing and export-led economy is now switching to a consumption and service-based one, fueling a need for more imports.
China will continue to significantly expand market access, strengthen IPR protection, and do more to increase imports.
New efforts like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Belt and Road Initiative are also propelling China's rise. For Chinese citizens, that means not just escaping poverty, but building a better life, a better environment, and a stronger, more secure China.
If you look at the young people in today's China, college students, they are very similar to their peers in Washington, New York, Tokyo, Taipei, and London.
There are a lot of statistics that highlight just how big an impact China's reform and opening up have had on the country and the world. One set of numbers in particular. In the 30 years between 1949 to 1978, only 200,000 Chinese travelled abroad. 40 years later, in 2017, Chinese citizens made over 130 million visits overseas.
That was CGTN's Nathan King reporting. Well, let's get to our panel right now. And Minister Councillor Jing Sing, I want to start with you. The Chinese story over the last 40 years has been an extraordinary story. Some have even called it a miracle. But I want to go back to 1978. And as we heard in that report there, Cheng Li saying that China was a very different country then. What were conditions like? What was the environment like that led the leaders of China to embark on the course of action that they took?
Well, I think the fundamental issue is the mission of the Chinese Communist Party and also the Chinese government. The mission of the government and the party is to bring about a better life for the Chinese people and also make the Chinese nation strong and prosperous in the world. However, after a couple of years of trying the planned economic system, we find that that was not working for the Chinese national economy. So we found that domestically, there was a need for us to reform the planned economic system. And also the Chinese economy back in 1978 was very poor. Our GDP was only 1.8% of the world total. I was raised in a small village in Shandong province, and there were 500 people in that village, pretty poor. I remember that my mom would put all the food in a basket and hang it up pretty high in the ceiling to keep it away from the cats and mouse and also from us kids. So it showed how scarcity was in China in terms of the economic development. So this was not socialism, and poverty was not socialism. On the international front, and I think the Chinese government also realized that Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and China's Taiwan were taking off, and China was left far behind. And they felt a sense of urgency and the pressure to reform the Chinese economy, to open up to the outside world and to learn from the rest of the world. And I think that's why we made the decision to reform and opening up ourselves to the outside world.
Martin, the Minister Councillor mentioned GDP just a moment ago. Let's look at that one metric. In 1978, China's GDP was 150 billion. In 2017, it was over $12 trillion. Those are remarkable figures. That's an 80-fold increase. China is now the world's second largest economy, as I mentioned. It's a major trading partner with over 130 countries. Put that into perspective for us. How significant is that growth?
Well, it's difficult to put it into perspective because it's so extraordinary. I mean, the rise of China in such a short period of time is utterly unparalleled in modern history. I mean, previously, the example would have been the rise of the United States, for example, from the second half of the 19th century until 1914, very dynamic period. But it pales into relative insignificance compared with China's transformation. And not least surprising about it is it was utterly unexpected. I mean, I'm sure from what you described in 1978, none of the leaders, including Deng Xiaoping, could possibly have thought that China would be where it is today. It's an unbelievable story. And I think the other thing I would add to this picture is, basically, the industrial world, the advanced world, as it were, had been the monopoly, more or less, of the West. The one exception was Japan, after the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century. And so for China to do what it's managed to do, of course, learning things from the Asian tigers and so on as well has been important, was really dramatic. And there are many things to say about this transformation. I think the thing I would like to emphasize just at this point now is something that is generally not said. And that is, it wasn't just a pragmatic road. It involved a serious rethink about what kind of strategy was appropriate for a socialist society like China. And Deng Xiaoping had the courage to do two big shifts. One, that socialism was not synonymous with simply planning and the state. And secondly, the idea of socialism in one country, socialism in one bloc, which had been prevalent ever since the 1920s with the Soviet Union and all that, but was also true in the Mao period and so on, was wrong. And that China should not think in those terms. China should see itself as part of the world. It had to be interdependent with the rest of the world. It had to compete with the capitalist world. It had to cooperate with it, had to learn from it, and so on. And these were two extraordinary shifts. And because it was not just pragmatic, but it was a sort of intellectual revolution.
Right.
It unleashed enormous intellectual energy in China, which I think is true to this day.
Yuquan Huang, let me get to you. China's President Xi Jinping has called this dramatic, significant rise in China, he's called it the second revolution. But, listening to Martin talking there, how revolutionary was the thinking among China's leaders at that time?
What's really interesting is that Deng Xiaoping did not have what I call set in concrete strategy for what needed to be done over the ensuing 20 or 30 years. He basically set out a couple principles. As Martin mentioned, we need to be more pragmatic, not tied down by ideology, principle one. And that led to the famous maxim, crossing the river by feeling the stones. We don't know what's going to happen, but we need to move forward. I think the second principle was a marriage between what I call central directives and local level initiatives. Let experimentation emerge. Best practices come forward, let's copy it. I think that was quite unusual. The third thing he did, I think, which is extraordinary and not well recognized, you have a centrally planned system, a social system, which is very inefficient, not been able to generate much growth at all. How do you change this without changing everything? So what he put in place was a system of local competition, that provinces and localities would compete with each other, that the party secretaries and governors who were being rotated around would be given growth targets, objectives, evaluated on that purpose. So what he did actually was to turn a system which was moribund into a highly competitive system internally, something we've never seen anywhere else in this world, because localities compete. And then he brought in the resources to actually look and go outward. So I mean, you talk about these indicators. In 1991, foreign investment in China was $4 billion. It's 50 by around 2000. It's 350 billion today. Growth, trade was a share of GDP, was 15% of GDP when he started. It rose to a high of 70% by 2005. So this kind of extraordinary shift, both internally and externally, we've never seen that before.
Robert, and of course, when China was opening up, it also opened up globally. Shortly after opening up, it established diplomatic relations with the United States in 1979. Deng Xiaoping came here to the United States. In fact, he came here to an office a few blocks from where we are sitting right now, at the White House. How important were those early Sino-US ties to China's opening up?
Extremely important. I remember the Minister Counselor made this point. I just want to reemphasize it. I went to China originally. I was working as Kissinger's economic advisor in the early 70s. And no one could have ever imagined what China was going to look like 20 years beyond. And certainly today, no one would have dreamt. And it's hard for Americans to understand, we had no economic relationship with China in the early 70s. There was no trade, there was no investment. There was no financial interaction. China was not part of the IMF, the World Bank, or the GATT at that point. China was really an economy which was following a very national, sort of local model. It did not integrate with the rest of the world. And the events of the late 1970s, early 1980s really were remarkable. One, because Deng Xiaoping understood that China couldn't continue the way it was. Things were going very badly economically. It was poor, and it had no strategy at all. He didn't have a particularly bold strategy that was long-term oriented, but he knew he couldn't continue the model of that period of time. And therefore, he experimented. I think that was one of the, when Roosevelt came in during the Depression, he said, what this country wants and needs is bold, persistent experimentation. I think Deng had the same view. And he was willing to have special economic zones. He was willing to give provinces more opportunity to do their thing and not necessarily follow a national model. He was willing to open up and visit other countries, as the film we just saw indicated. He came to the United States. And I can remember having conversations with him during that period. And one of the things he was most proud of is the fact that he enabled Chinese students to study abroad. He enabled foreign advisors to come to China. Not that he was going to buy everything the West did or said, but that he could use these experiences. And at one conversation that was particularly meaningful for me, I was commenting on the changes that were about to take place or were taking place. This is late 1970s, early 80s. He said, just wait. He said, we have 10,000 Chinese students studying abroad. When they come home, they're going to change China. And he didn't mean that they were going to be able to take over right away, but the ideas that China could take from other countries, not from the Soviet Union, which he regarded as a failed economic experiment from the beginning, but learning from other countries, the United States, Japan, Korea, numerous other countries. He understood that the transformation of China would depend largely, of course, on the people of China. He understood that. But the people of China needed opportunity to experiment, to learn new things, new ways of doing things. And one way was to interact with the rest of the world. So he definitely saw China as changing internally, but also interacting with the rest of the world in the way that China had not done during the Cultural Revolution or before.
Well, Robert, you mentioned the special economic zones. China had to take steps to kickstart this change. We have a very visual example of the transformation that took place in China. Now, one of the first phases of major economic reform was the setting up of special economic zones, as we've been talking about here. And one of those was a small town called Shenzhen. We want to give you a sense of how reform and opening up has transformed just one location in China over the last 40 years. Here is Shenzhen's story. Let's watch.
Shenzhen. It was just a fishing village. 40 years ago, about 30,000 people lived there. But that all changed when it became China's first special economic zone. "40 years later, look at it now. A modern metropolis with 100 skyscrapers over 200 meters high. More than 12 million people live here. A young city, the average age is 32. Workers flock to Shenzhen from all over China, a model for opening up and economic reform. It's an innovative, booming high-tech center and hosts international technology conventions. Several Fortune 500 companies are based here. Major enterprises like internet giant Tencent. One of the world's largest phone companies, ZTE, is here too. So are startups for the future. WeArk Zhongwei wants to be an industry leader in his business. Environmental entrepreneur Yao Jie left IT to start Greenin. Shenzhen is a major financial center, even has its own stock exchange, and is home to the world's third largest container port. 40 years of reform and opening up. One city, Shenzhen.
Zhou Jingxing, looking at those pictures there and the transformation that it reflects, how important was those special economic zones in the initial period of change, let's say in the first 10 years?
Imagine this, back in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was very hard to push ahead with the reform and opening up program because there were a lot of old thinkings and mindset. So that's why Deng Xiaoping called for the emancipation of mindset. And people had to see what was this reform and opening up was about. So I think that the special economic zones played a role as a kind of a test ground for all the policies that the Chinese government would take throughout the country. And as a matter of fact, after a couple of years, most of the policies in the special economic zones were applied elsewhere throughout the country. And they were kind of the driving force for the whole national economic development. And secondly, I think it is also very important to note that these special economic zones served as a kind of springboard for the other provinces and cities in China to go global, to move overseas. And that was kind of a gateway for their success abroad. And thirdly, I think that these special economic zones also gave the rest of the world a kind of a sense of confidence in the Chinese government's decision and determination to push ahead with the reform and opening up. It means that the Chinese are serious about reform. They are serious about taking the step to open up their economy. So let's go to China. So I think these special economic zones played a very important role that should not be underestimated.
Yukon Huang, we know that one of the initial steps taken by the Chinese authorities was to allow state-owned farms and state-owned enterprises to sell surplus stuff. But how did China adapt to a market-oriented economy? I mean, where did the investment come from?
Well, these initial steps, the success of the household responsibility system, the township village enterprises, essentially capitalized on the resources of the farmers themselves, the local authorities. So around 1980, you basically have a country which is essentially, in my view, bankrupt. Hardly any foreign exchange, no budgetary resources to speak of. So what did Deng Xiaoping basically do in terms of saying, how can I find the resources to invest for the infrastructure development? Two major sources. Special economic zones brings in foreign investment. So it goes from 4 billion to 300 billion over 10 or 15, 20 years. That's the foreign money comes in. Domestically, extreme poverty. You can't collect taxes when people are so poor. So he tapped the resources of Chinese households who had been saving a lot over the years, parked it in the banking system, and Deng Xiaoping managed to tap those household savings to finance a huge program of infrastructure development, beginning first along the coast and then into the interior, realizing that the importance was to try to connect China with the global economy. And this was a very unique situation because today, every government, rich or poor, is struggling with the question is, how can I finance the investment needs of my country because of a budgetary problem, whatever. So he managed to figure out a way to get out of this problem in a situation where most people would have been stuck.
Martin, you know, Yukon mentioned extreme poverty in China. One of the major goals, of course, as the Minister Chancellor told us as well, was to lift people out of poverty. And let's take a look at what China has done. 770 million people lived at or below the poverty line. That was in 1978. That number in 2017 was down to just 30 million. And it's probably lower now because we've heard President Xi Jinping tell us that his goal is to eradicate poverty completely by 2020. Was that perhaps the biggest success of opening up and reform?
Well, I think that, of course, it made a huge difference to the lives of half the Chinese population because they were taken out of poverty. But I also think that globally, the fact that China managed to reduce poverty on such a huge scale so quickly had a very big impact on attitudes towards China during this period. I mean, if we're going to use this kind of language, but this was a real soft power message, really, about China. And the fact is that, between something like 1990 and 2005, China was responsible for 3/4 of the global reduction in poverty. I mean, there was just no other country, developing country, that was performing like this in relationship to poverty. And however skeptical people may be or have been about China, no one can take that away from China. I mean, China gets criticized for human rights, but in fact, the greatest human right that you can give to people is to deliver them out of poverty. That is the baseline for anything.
Zhou Jingxing, if we look at some of what the leaders did in China, Deng Xiaoping, and Robert mentioned this a moment ago, went on a southern tour in 1992. What did that achieve, and how significant was it for China's development?
Well, if you take a look from at the reform of China and opening to the outside world from 1978 to 1991, I would personally call it possibly that it was the first stage, because that was some kind of the launching period for the Chinese economy to change the planned economic system. And then because of these changes brought great changes to the society and also to the people's mindset. And then there were kind of a confusion. And internationally, remember that in the late 1990s, there were this collapses of the former Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries. And so the international situation also played a very important role in shaping the mindset of the Chinese people. And therefore, there were different voices about the direction of the Chinese economy. There were different voices about the Chinese reforms and opening up in the early 1990s. And therefore, I think Deng Xiaoping saw the future, and he showed the rest of the world his vision where China should be going. So he came out and made the southern tour, and his message was very important. One is that we will continue to adhere to the reform and opening up policy, and this policy will remain unchanged, in his words, for 100 years. And I think the second message that he sent is that we will continue to use the special economic zones and other places as the test ground to move ahead with the economic development, because this is something that China is doing that has never been experimented by any other country in the world. So I think that the 1992 Southern Tour by Deng Xiaoping played a very important role to move the reform and opening up of China to a second stage, which paved way for the establishment of the market economic system at the 14th Party Congress in 1992. And it also paved way for what we see as the Chinese economic development today.
Robert, another big milestone, I guess, was China joining the WTO in 2001. What did membership do for China?
That was really one of the 2 or 3 most significant developments in this dramatic story of the rise of China. I just want to add one point before I get there, and that is that the infrastructure that Deng Xiaoping put in with the savings that he generated from households was important in the sense that it made a dramatic step in helping people get out of poverty, because it enabled them to be mobile, to move around. One of the interesting things is the development of these cities was no accident. He built the cities, but he also created infrastructure for people to come there. And I think that this enabling of people to rise out of poverty was in fact part and parcel of an effort to enable people to be more mobile, to get around, to go from poor areas of China to growing areas of China, which was extremely important. People had been confined to villages before that. Now they could move, and they could go where opportunity was. And this relates directly to your question about the WTO. And I think the genius of the leaders at that point, and I give Premier Zhu Rongji a great deal of credit for this vision. The US sort of confuses what the WTO membership for China was all about. Surely it was about giving China greater access to markets around the world. That it did. And as you can see, the trade numbers went up quite dramatically, but it did something else. And this was the real genius of this, and that is Zhu Rongji understood that he needed to continue the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. Why did Deng Xiaoping go into southern China on the China tour? Because he saw the reforms sort of slowing down. He wanted to give them a shot in the arm, a boost. Zhu Rongji wanted to do the same thing, and he realized that he couldn't do it just by pushing internally on the institutions of China. What he did do was to say, we want more opportunities in the global economy. If we want to take advantage of those opportunities, if we want to get into the WTO, we have to continue the reform process in China. A, to comply with WTO rules so we can get in and get these benefits. But two, even if we get in to the WTO and we don't reform, we don't become more competitive, we're not going to be able to take full advantage of the benefits of access to all these markets. So he used two kinds of leverage. One, he pushed very hard to get other countries, and especially the United States, to allow China to join the WTO. And the US did. The US had a view of a more inclusive environment, and that would include China. So the United States, after a long negotiation, did agree and support enthusiastically in the end China joining. But this did something else. It also gave a big boost to reform in China, because he could go to people who otherwise might not want to do these reforms and say, if you want the benefits of greater access to these foreign markets and you want to be able to take advantage of these opportunities, we've got to do a lot more at home. So after Deng's tour of southern China, this was another shot in the arm that enabled China to do this. It was really part and parcel of giving the next boost to China's reforms.
Okay, I want to change gear a bit here. We have sought questions from around the world. We have a question now from London, which we recorded earlier. Joining us is Duncan Ray. He's with a small business enterprise called Focus SB. Let's listen to his question.
Focus SB has been doing business in China for 2 years now. So tell me, how difficult would it have been for Focus SB to have entered the Chinese markets in mainland China 40 years ago?
Yukon Huang, do you want to respond to that?
Well, until China started to open up through special export processing zones, essentially you had very limited foreign investment in China. And if you came in, you had a problem, of course. You didn't have a domestic market that you could sell into. Incomes are so low. You're really trying to establish a market to sell outside of China. And that's what the first group of foreign investors came into, bringing in inputs and then basically going out. Financing is not available. You have to bring in your own financing. You can't find it very, very locally. So it was very, very difficult. Many of the initial foreign investments, they all had to come in under what I would call joint ventures. You had to find a Chinese partner, a sponsor. So about 75% of the foreign investment 20 years ago occurred through joint ventures. Only about 20% was what I call wholly owned enterprises. This has changed. Today, only about a quarter of the foreign investment is coming in under joint ventures. The bulk of it is now coming under wholly owned enterprises. So now you see what I call a domestic market today, which of course is dramatically different from what it was before. Financing is readily available in many ways because the resources are so much larger. The regulatory environment has also evolved. There are still concerns about equal treatment. So foreign companies are complaining today about whether or not they can be treated the same way as domestic companies. But the situation today is, in fact, dramatically better than it was 10 or 15 years ago.
Martin, I have a bit of a broad-based question here. You know, when China started implementing these policies, many in the West, many here, right here in the United States, believed that China would fail, that this blend of socialism and capitalism and communism and whatever else you want to add to it would not work. How did China pull it off?
Well, it's an extraordinary story, I think. I mean, there was a widespread view in the West that it would probably fail, firstly, but secondly, if it did succeed, it was basically the thin end of the wedge, and China would become just like any Western economy, if you like. It would become a sort of capitalist economy. And I mean, we generally people got it wrong, what was happening in China and where it was going to go and what its potential was. And I think that the lesson here from China's achievements and Deng Xiaoping's insights was that a new kind of model was required, which combined the market dynamism with the role of the state, with the role of the public, with the role of government, and that these two things together, interacting, could create the potential for something extraordinary. And now, at the time, in the Western view, as I said, was that, oh, this will go and become like us. I don't think that ever happened. I think what China really did in an extraordinary fashion was to create something new, a new model that we haven't seen before. And it's interesting to reflect. I mean, one of the things that's characteristic of the socialist tradition by the time Deng was coming up with the initiatives and so on, was how ossified it was, how lacking in thought it was, how backdated it was, and how certain it was that it was going to succeed, the sort of guarantees of history, which is the worst kind of thing, mentality for trying to make change and to experiment and so on. And what Deng did, what the leadership of the Communist Party did with these reforms was to create a completely experimental, open-ended way of thinking. There was no clear, there was a view of possible vision, but there was no route map, really. So this required enormous initiative. It can't be done by a few people. It has to be spread across society and imbue the people of China. And I think that one of the most remarkable achievements of the reform period is the way in which it has transformed the Chinese people. They are now sources of great energy, of commitment, of openness, of inquiry, of curiosity, and of innovation. And they have done it.
Right. Zhou Jingxin, I'm wondering, it just didn't transform the Chinese people, did it? It transformed the Communist Party. I mean, at one time, the Communist Party was comprised of peasants and workers, and then it became a party of college-educated technocrats. How important was that change?
Well, before answering that question, can I follow up on
Absolutely. Go ahead.
On Deng Xiaoping?
Yeah.
I think the debates at the time in the early 1990s and also late 1980s was about whether the special economic zones were socialist or capitalist. And that was a very important debate. And I agree with that possibly Deng Xiaoping did not have a roadmap toward today's China. But I think one thing he was quite sure, that is that he was going to continue with the reform and opening up. So basically speaking on the debates, and he said that if you could answer definitely with a yes to all the three questions, and then that is socialism. The first one is that whether what we are doing is conducive to improve the productive forces. And second is what we are doing, whether it is going to be helpful for strengthening China's Chinese as a nation or improve our national strength. And the third is whether it is going to help improve the people's livelihood. So he was very sure about that. And then the debates were gone and people continued to focus on the economic development. And I think this also led to the continue the change of the Communist Party of China, because the party has already transformed from a revolutionary party whose mission was to establish the government to a ruling party whose job was to run the economy, run the social life, and run the country, in a word. So it was very important for, I think that it was very important for people to see the difference between the Revolutionary Party and the ruling party. And Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese leadership saw the difference. And that was why they started to have all the people who wanted to join the party and who have the capability, who also identify themselves with the values of the party as party members. Because anyway, this is a party that is running the country, and it has to have a lot of elite people in there.
Right. Yukon, if I bring this right up to contemporary China right now, this is what the director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, had to say at the recent Shanghai Import Expo. Let's watch.
In the first 3 quarters of this year only, consumption contributed 78% of China's GDP growth, as opposed to 50% only 5 years ago. This transition, which is symbolized by the China International Import Expo, is good for China, but it is good for the world, including all those who see China as a vital and vibrant market.
So, Yukon, how important is the trend of Chinese consumption as people get better off?
So what the IMF managing director is saying is consumption in China today is growing at about 7.5% a year. That's twice as high as any country in the world these days. And it's extraordinary, it needs to be sustained. But as a share of GDP, therefore, it's increasing because GDP growth is now below 7%. Okay. But interestingly, and here's very confusing, the growth rate of consumption has actually declined. It used to grow at 8.5% a year, because China is growing at 10% a year.
Okay, we are going to take a quick break right now, and when we come back, we will take a closer look at the global impact of these policies. Stay with us as we bring you a CGTN Town Hall special program, 40 Years and Beyond, China Reform and Opening Up.